Hello, everybody. Oh, there it is. Saturday, December 27th, 6:30-ish Central Time. Hope everybody's been doing well. This is live. If you're out there, feel free to drop a hello in the chat, and I'll hopefully be paying attention. So this is a unsolicited, unrequested reaction video to one of Shane Starr's videos. He has and been sort of out of the game lately, just busy with work and stuff. So I've been catching up on some videos of some of the channels, the personality type channels out there. And Shane has a series, which I'd invite everybody to go see, on tying the book, The 48 Laws of Power, from, what's the guy's name? Richard Green, Robert Green, something like that. Let me look it up real quick. I want to make sure. Yeah, Robert Green. And tying the functions to sort of some of the laws or some of the principles that come out of that book. And as always, Shane likes to, I think he likes to do these sort of tying functions to real world phenomena, which I think is always very interesting. And I try to do the same myself. But he's got, various series, and this is one of the latest. So definitely go and check it out. So I haven't seen all of them, but I wanted to jump on and make a reaction video to the FE video, because I think it highlights a lot of the issues and sort of could be sort of, again, an unsolicited, unrequested teaching moment on FE. And my own personal theory of Robert Greene and his books. If you're not familiar with Robert Greene, let me take a little aside here. I don't really know what his real background is, like what his credentials are or anything, but he has this series of books that I'm pretty sure it started with 48 Laws of Power, where and I'm going to get into this in more detail in a second, but there's sort of these how-to guides, I think, geared towards people who are pretty heavily TE oriented and not FE oriented at all. And they are these how-to books on basically personal interaction. 48 Laws of Power is, again, this sort of almost technical guide for rising through the ranks and taking power over, or sort of taking power over. I'm not even entirely sure what the end goal is, but just to teach you what power is and how people achieve it in sort of this technical way. And it's broken into 48 laws. And I don't really know how anything could have 48 laws, but that's beside the point. I mean, 1 law, 2 law, 3 laws, 4 laws. Once you get past 4 laws, now you're just making shit up. But that's beside the point. But it's this 48 laws, and there are these little principles or, vignettes of, here are some examples of how somebody sort of acted in a particular scenario or situation and exerted their power or gained power or kept their power, didn't lose their power. And then he'll also provide counter examples too throughout the book of, ways of sort of breaking the rule, and then it results in somebody losing their power and whatnot. Point being, and it's a somewhat interesting book if you just sort of look at it from sort of the historical perspective of some fucked up things that people have done in the world. But using it as this sort of how-to manual really grinds my gears. and this is no shade at Shane at all, but I think it is a very ISTJ, INTJ thing. And I'm going to get into that in a second. And Robert Greene has these other books on seduction and he's this really kind of swarmy, not very, I hate to say it, but not very attractive, kind of, I don't know, weaselly kind of guy, very academic. But he writes these books on seducing people and power, and and he's not the type of person that you would look at and say, that's a powerful, seductive guy. Um, but he's probably some sort of INTP or ENTP, heavy TE, that has sort of figured this way of dissecting things into sort of this process or something. Um, and it's certainly not based off of his life experience. I'm sure it's based off of more of just sort of evaluating these historical vignettes, and I don't even know if they're all historically accurate or true. They could just be sort of apocryphal stories that have made their way through time. I don't know. But the point, let me get to the point here. So I've made comments in previous videos about people who are FE polar, ISTJs and INTJs, and my sort of run-ins with them, because I'm surrounded by ISTJs and INTJs in my career, in my field of work, and you get a lot of young ISTJs, INTJs, because they're very bright, they're very good at working, they're very process oriented, and so you see a lot of them, especially younger ones in the business field, that are sort of fresh out of college. And and in large organizations where they're sort of recruiting people and bringing people on board, they'll do these internships and stuff, and they'll take everybody aside and give everybody sort of the same speech, but you can kind of tell that they're geared towards the INTJs and the ISTJs, in the sense that they like to take you aside and give you these little I don't know, lessons or principles or little how-to pieces of advice on interacting with, more senior people at the firm or at the company, partners, management. What do you do when you're at a baseball game with them or at a party, and interacting with clients and yada, yada, yada. And there are these rules, like, don't drink more than 2 beers, and don't talk to somebody for more than like 5 or 10 minutes, or again, and they literally will like, tell you, okay, here's the guidelines, here's the steps to follow. And if you're not FE polar, like, all this stuff is kind of like, yeah, I get it, but okay, I think I'll be fine, but I appreciate the help. And they're usually coming, and the words of advice are usually coming from other ISTJs and other INTJs who learned it and picked it up along the way. And so now they're just sort of passing along, their little how-to steps of interacting with people. And these Robert Greene books remind me a lot of that, where they're geared. Yeah, I could. Yeah, it's probably pretty dark. Somebody made the comment, "My light's off." Hopefully, you can see me a little bit. But anywho, so these books remind me of that, of giving ISTJs and INTJs these sort of lessons on like how to interact with people, how to basically how to engage in FE processes. And it tries to boil it down to a series of TE steps or TE rules, right? If you're in this scenario, then you do this. If you do this, then you do that, blah, 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 sort of plan accordingly. But it sort of misses the entire point of FE. And FE cannot be reduced to simple rules. It can be reduced to principles. There are general principles of interacting with people, but there aren't step-by-step rules. It's not practice my old friend. Oh, sorry, getting distracted by the comments. Can you guys see me at all, or is it like totally dark? Because I could see me. Okay. Somebody commented that I'm resembling a sleep paralysis Steven. I'll go with that. I'll, that could be my brand, the sleep paralysis Steven. um, okay, but seriously, can you guys see me at all? Okay. Anyways, I'm gonna keep going. If you literally can't see me, tell me. But if it's just that it's dark and dim, I'll go with dark and dim. I don't really expect a whole lot of people to be watching this, as opposed to just listening. But anywho, so FE is nonlinear, which is probably the most salient point that for those of you who are FE polar out there need to realize that it's completely nonlinear. It's completely interactive. People are weird. Like I always like to say, you can't program your interaction with people and boil it down to 48 laws of power or 48 algorithms or 33 rules of seduction or whatever the hell Robert Greene is trying to sell you. It doesn't work that way. Now, I mean, again, there are sort of general principles. There's sort of things that you can, you know, talk to people about, but it's not going to come down to formula. And let me give you another example. And I give this example all the time too. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was this whole movement of what they would call pickup artists. And they even had like shows on MTV or one of the channels. And there are these guys that were probably like ENFPs or ENFJs or something, um, that would go around teaching younger guys who were probably all IATJs and ISTJs on how to pick up women. And they would have these little rules of like, well, wear something interesting and wear something that you could talk about, or, a cowboy hat or goggles or something, and, and here, here's your opening line. And there's this whole system and this whole, like, these code words and like this whole language revolved around it. And you'd see like snippets of them teaching these classes, and they're literally guys like taking notes, like, how to approach girls. And again, because you have this audience of people who see the world as mechanical, like there's an algorithm, there's a rule, um, there's some sort of formula that if you follow it, you're going to, achieve whatever goal, right? A very TE type of view of the world. Completely losing sight of, how FE really works, and probably losing sight of just the rule of large numbers. And if you just keep trying it over and over again, eventually it's gonna, something's gonna click and something's gonna work. But again, they would sell it as this system, right? And of course all the ISTJs and INTJs would sort of buy into it. And again, half of it was probably just getting them out of their shell and getting them into the game. And it's once you do that, that's half the battle, right? But it wasn't really teaching them FE stuff. It was just teaching them how to, I don't know, not be nervous, I guess, or come across as confident. So, I mean, maybe in that sense it worked. Okay. So, whenever I see somebody, and again, this is no shade at shade. I hope he doesn't take offense to it. But whenever I see somebody with that 48 laws of power book, like especially if I work with them, like I almost want to like fire them on the spot. Like, this is just horseshit. This is like, you're being grifted into this idea that you can teach somebody how social interaction works. And if you really want to learn how social interaction works, especially like, the pickup artists or reading Robert Greene's seduction book or whatever, and you're a guy, just go watch some soap operas for like 2 weeks. It'll teach you everything that you need to know about what women want in men. Just watch how men act in soap operas, and that's exactly how you act. You don't need any sort of formula or any sort of book, to teach you this shit. But you know, again, if you're Effie Pollard, it's sort of your blind spot. Maybe that doesn't occur to you, and maybe watching soap operas, it's not going to work. Who knows? What if people find the book effective? Well, again, the 48 Laws of Power book, I can't imagine. Honestly, here's my take on 48 Laws of Power, whether or not I think it could ever be effective. One of the very first early rules, I don't know what number it is, but it's out there, where it says guard your reputation as if your life depended on it, right? Like your reputation is the most important thing especially in your career, your professional life. And it's something to the effect of guard your reputation with your life. Says this very early on in the book. It could even be maybe even the first one. I don't remember. But then it goes on and starts giving you all this like shady, underhanded Machiavellian advice of interacting with people and being totally weaselly and slimy and underhanded. And if you really acted like that in the professional world, in the professional setting, you would be ostracized and kicked out so quickly. And not only that, but people had this sort of romanticized, I think, idea of like what it's like to be in the business world. It's this cutthroat, competitive, win at all costs kind of world. And it's not that at all. And I have been, I've seen very, very powerful, very, very, in government, in the business world, very high up people I work with all the time, and they are not like that at all. They follow the rules. They, like the last thing they want to do is lose their reputation. Like that rule I do agree with, or principle, is that you have to guard your reputation with your life because it's the only thing that you can lose once and never get it back. And most people, there are some outliers in the business world. There's some pretty shady people, and I'll admit that. But the vast majority of them follow the rules and play by, the professional code of conduct, whatever that might be. And if it's because they're scared or they're going to lose their job or it's just they morally agree with it, I don't know. But by far more people act like that, and they don't do the shady underhanded shit that the 48 Laws of Power tries to teach people about. And that's true in government. It's true in maybe not as much in government. There's probably more shady people in government, but I mean, we all know. But especially in the business world, people that are in high level CEO management positions, by and large, want their company and their people who work for their company to succeed. And they know doing shady, underhanded shit is, sort of the fast track out. Now, the problem is every once in a while, you have the Enrons or you have, the early 2000s, WorldCom, stuff like that, where people were doing some shady shit and it blew up their company. And, the banking crisis and all that, so yes, it does happen. I'm not completely naive to the fact that it happens, but the fact that, it blows up and it has such big ramifications should be evidence of the fact that it's not happening all the time. It's like when it does happen, it's catastrophic. And that's why, the vast majority of people avoid it. And when they're doing things, they're just sort of like going along with the flow a lot of times. It's just like everybody else is doing it, so it must be okay. And then eventually just sort of unravels. And that, like, the banking crisis was like that, where I don't really think anybody was like trying to do this 48 laws of power shit and, underhand, being sort of underhanded in that way or weaselly in that way. They're just kind of doing what everybody else was doing, and it just unraveled, unfortunately. But hey, that's the capitalistic system. That's what we live in. Anyways, so back to my point about personality. Like, again, you can't teach FE. You have to experience FE. You have to, or I mean, the way that you learn about it is you learn about it through life. You read books, you read about the humanities, you watch soap operas, you watch movies, you watch people that interact with people. You don't, it doesn't get distilled down to a technical manual. Could you specify the advice you don't like? Yeah. Let me. So one of the commenters is asking which advice I don't like. So I'm going to list out the rules here and find them. Because conceal your intentions, win through actions, never through argument. Okay, that's fine. Crush your enemy totally. Really? I mean, that's a law of power. Crush your enemy totally. Very Machiavellian shit. And and Machiavelli was like in large part a joke, but I guess some people take it seriously. And and like I said, there's probably a few rules scattered in there here and there that are probably, okay, fine. It's not all horseshit, but there is some real like underhanded weaselly stuff. And if you read the book or listen to the book or just even read the rules, like the synopsis of the rules, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. However, this isn't really, my point isn't really just to shit on the 48 laws of power, but more of the I guess the underlying premise of it all, that you could teach people how to engage in FE kind of stuff. And it just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. Okay. Anywho, so that's my rant on that. I think I've probably made the point, but point being, and I know I keep saying point being because I'm all over the place, that FE is nonlinear. There's no algorithm. It's interaction with people. You have to know you have to know you're dealing with a feedback loop, a feedback mechanism. I say this, they react this way. Oh, I wasn't expecting that reaction, so I'm going to go to this. Okay, now they react like that. Now I react like this. Now I react like that. And it's this iterative process, right? Back and forth loop. And it's why there is a completely separate neural system, the orbital lateral frontal cortex, that deals with this shit, right? Because you can't deal with it with your rational part of your brain, that's figuring out how to do math problems and read technical specs and guides and do coding and all that kind of stuff that all you ISTJs and INTJs out there are proficient at. Completely different part of the brain, completely different type of information that you're processing. It's nonlinear. And I can't stress that enough. And so let me get back to Shade's video on FE, because he made some points that, again, this is totally unsolicited and unrequested, but I'm an INFJ, so we have to express our opinion anyway. whether we're asked for it or not. And he made a few points about in the workplace how people with FE may get promoted or get opportunities, hired, promoted into a new position, maybe a raise, maybe they get the better work, I don't know, because of FE as opposed to their TE proficiencies, right? Yeah. Sorry, the comment asked, am I talking about Shade Star? Yes, Shade Star. I'll link his channel below. Friend of the program. And so he's making comments, and it's sort of in the, you know, within the overall theme of the 48 Laws of Power, of like people can advance and gain power through these FE type of actions or rules. And but he makes some comments about they sort of they get into these positions with their FE, even though they're probably not competent on a TE or maybe a TI level. But they, I mean, we all know the type, right? The empty suits who sort of fail upwards, so to speak, or get their jobs because of who they know, not what they know, or get the promotion because everybody likes them and they've got charisma. But if you sat them down and asked them to do a math problem or something, they couldn't do it, or fill out a TPS report or whatever the job requires. But this leads me to a bigger point about what all of this psychological types, personality type stuff is about. And that's about understanding yourself and understanding the world around you and being able to categorize things as, oh, that's an FE thing. That's a TE thing. And let me step back and get to what I'm talking about. And in the real world, in the business world, there's this common phenomenon of when a CEO retires or leaves a company and trying to replace the CEO. And a lot of times the number two guy or gal at the company is the CFO. And the CFO is, largely in charge of the finances. How do you spend the money? How do you allocate the money? How are you doing your accounting? How you're reporting things? All that kind of stuff. And it's a very, very TE operational type of job, right? Doesn't require a whole lot of FE unless you have a huge accounting department that you have to lead. But usually the CFO is an operationals guy, an operation type guy. And a lot of times you'll see in companies, even big, large public companies, where the CEO leaves, retires, for whatever reason, they have to replace the CEO. And a lot of times they'll go with the CFO or some sort of operations person. It could be the CFO, it could be the COO, chief operating officer, but somebody who's more of an operational person, like runs the actual business. And a lot of times, sometimes it works. There's some noticeable cases of when it works, but a lot of times it doesn't work. And the reason is a lot of times they lose sight of what the CEO is actually doing. And the CEO, most CEOs that I interact with are heavy, heavy FE people. They are not operational people. They are not like, oh, we need to do this, we need to do that. They're not the people who are getting up at 6 a.m. and plotting out their day and writing out, they're just not operational people. Yes, I'm sure there are some out there, obviously. But if I had to just create sort of the idyllic platonic CEO, they're going to be an ESFJ or maybe an ENFJ, because ultimately the CEO is in charge of the organization, running the organization and getting the people to do what he or she needs them to do, right? Very FE stuff. And they spend their day sort of dealing with political squabbles, like this person wants to do this, but this person wants to do that, and we don't have the money for this, and we don't have the money for that, and we, and I need to make sure that both these people are happy. I can't run the risk of losing either of them, and so I have to play diplomat, right? I have to find a solution. I have to find something that's fair, right? There's no TE rule that Robert Greene is going to come up with that tells you how to deal with that sort of jump ball situation, so to speak, and dealing with personalities and dealing with decisions on this FE level as opposed to a TE level. And so a lot of successful CEOs have very heavy FE. Just go watch them all. Go watch interviews. And I know that there are very notable exceptions, like the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs and probably the Jeff Bezos. Yes, they are exceptions, to this. But I'm talking about 90% of the other world. And even they have to sort of step back and let somebody else actually run the company. From an FE perspective, like there's the lady who always was at Facebook that wrote the lead-in book. I always forget her name, but she was like Mark Zuckerberg's FE person, right? Because I think he learned early on that he couldn't do the FE stuff. So anyways, but leading an organization is very FE. And so taking a step back and going back to the comments that Shane had made in the video, and again, this isn't critiquing Shane at all, but more of a general point of what is all this psychological personality type stuff about. And again, a lot of it is about accepting what you do and what you're good at, and accepting what other people are good at, and realizing that, okay, there are things in the world that are FE things, like being a CEO, being a manager. And sometimes those FE people are going to, you might think of them as empty suits, or people who have, just sort of charmed their way, through the organization. But a lot of times that's what the organization needs. They need somebody who's an FE person, who's going to be the face of the company, that's going to go out there and get the clients or run the organization and make people happy. They're going to bring in the birthday cakes. They're going to bring in the donuts. They're going to do all that FE stuff that makes people feel welcome and, want to be there and want to work there. And so sometimes you just have to step back and if you're a real heavy TE user, maybe you don't want that promotion. Maybe that other job that this FE person that they're putting the FE person into is more of an FE job. And if you had it, you'd kill yourself. Like now all of a sudden you have to be making those diplomatic decisions of when John and Sally are, squabbling over the budget, and you have to make both of them happy. How do you do that? And do you really want to spend every day making those types of decisions? And so sometimes when you are in one of these situations where you see people succeeding and or getting promoted or getting that job or that raise or whatever, sometimes you have to step back and say, okay, well, if I was in their shoe, would I want that job? Would I want to be doing what they're doing? Because that's real heavy FE shit. And I'm a TE operations person. And, going back to the example of the CFO taking over for the CEO, which you see a lot of companies do, they'll sort of bump the number 2 guy up to the CEO position. And a lot of times it's temporary, to sort of test drive them, but a lot of times it doesn't work out as well just because CFO sees their job as operations, running the business, counting the numbers, doing all that TE stuff. And then they have to spend their whole day dealing with political, interpolitical bullshit, office drama, or going out and trying to, drum up the sales team and get the numbers up and all that. And that's just, that's FE stuff. It's FE stuff. And if you get a TE person in an FE job, they're gonna fucking hate it. Like why would you want that? And so out of any of the two sort of diametrically opposed functions, TE and FE are probably the biggest ones when it comes to like the getting your career, getting your job, because they're your sort of, how do you make a decision in the here and now, and I need to make this thing run. And is this thing a thing, like a process, a system, an accounting process, or a computer code or something like that? Then that's a good TE job. Or is this thing all these people who their livelihood depends on you? If you fuck up, they lose their job. The company goes bankrupt, they lose their job, and now you're responsible for them and their family, going through a pretty hard time, right? Do you want that on your shoulders? Like, do you think you have the FE, capacity to, handle that kind of stuff? But again, some businesses, it's okay. You can have an ENTJ running it. I get it. There's a lot of ENTJs running shit. But a lot of times they run it very operationally and they need help. Like think Mark Zuckerberg. And the smart ones will realize that, that they can sort of plan the business and taking over the world and all that kind of stuff. But they're going to have to surround themselves with FE people who are going to make those FE decisions for them. Tech people. Okay. I'm going to read some comments here. I think I made my point. What if people find this book effective? Yeah, the 48 Laws of Power. If you find it effective, fine, but don't come work for me, because the last thing I want is somebody thinking that they can pull that shit and it's actually going to work in a real business setting. Good luck. Could you specify the advice you don't like? That might be a whole other video, but I could probably throw a dart at a dartboard with those rules and have a 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 3 chance of hitting a rule I don't like, that I think is shady and underhanded. We say Shane. Yes, I'm talking about Shane Starr, friend of the program. And again, not shitting on him, just trying to take the opportunity to say, this is a way of looking at life through the personality type lens. Like understanding that some things are TE things and some things are FE things. And if your God-given gift is being TE, why would you want to fuck around with the FE stuff and vice versa? Someone's cousin, tech people, right? So yeah, a lot of people get hired because of nepotism, who they know, all that kind of stuff. And and in my experience, it doesn't really last unless they actually are good. I mean, there is sometimes there's a reason to hire the boss's kid, because genetics. Like if the boss is pretty good at this type of thing, their chances are their kid might be too. Not all the time, obviously, but you got a smart boss, chances are you got a smart kid. But they're going to have different personality types, obviously, and maybe not run the business the same way. And point being, yeah, when you have nepotism and you hire the nephew or the cousin or whatever, if it doesn't work, people figure it out pretty quickly and they just sort of move on, and whoever it was that got hired through nepotism sort of takes the experience and moves on to the next job. And most firms have some sort of nepotism policy, where they don't allow it, just to make it easier to just say, we don't allow it. Most institutions I've been involved with, have some sort of policy like that. Even academic, like universities, will have things like that, which makes it very hard. If two academics trying to, two professors trying to find a job. Without FE at work, the people would be treated as tools. Yeah, I mean, entirely, right? Not only, well, you know, unless all the ISTJs and INTJs and ENTJs and ESTJs read better books than the 48 Laws of Power. There are some better management books out there of like how to deal with people, um, and better quote unquote rules of leadership. Again, I see them more as principles than rules because it's nonlinear, it's not algorithmic. But it is something that every once in a while they can sort of teach themselves. But if you're FE polar, again, you have to realize, okay, I'm an operations person, and um, dealing with all this FE shit, we'll get somebody else to do that. And that's why large organizations use the MBTI and stuff like that, because they want to have, sort of, this word has been bastardized, but they want a diverse set of diverse management, in the sense of some people have better skills at things than others, um, and it's not race or gender based. Obviously, it's personality based. Um, and if you have, and this is probably one of the biggest things, red flags that I'll see with a company or management, is if you've got too much TE and no FE, um, because that'll last for a while everybody's sort of rowing in the same direction. But eventually you're going to get, if you're successful, you're going to get bigger, and you're going to have people who are not getting stock options, or they're not getting, they're not driving towards payday of selling the company. They're just there to do the day-to-day stuff. And you need people who treat them like people and um, and make it a welcoming and inviting place. And the TE people, it's not to say that they can't. I mean, they certainly try a lot of times, but they're so focused on the technical, the operations part of the business, that they can't be bothered with the personality stuff, or the human interaction stuff. And you do need those people, in my humble opinion. um, once you get to an organization of a certain size, small, lean, mean organizations, whatever, I'm sure they can do it on their own. But at some point, when you're dealing with people, you have to realize you're dealing with people and not tools, like this commenter said. ENTJs can come off pretty direct and cold, from my experience, though I hear some are charming with their FI. Yeah, so ENTJs, I mean, they're sort of the quintessential CEOs, right? Because they refuse to work for anybody. Um, my experience, again, this is just me. Um, they're definitely visionaries. They definitely sort of see they're very opportunistic. They see opportunities in the market, right? Where somebody will have an idea, like a fledgling of an idea of a business, and they might be missing, they got steps 1, 2, and 3, but they're missing steps 4 and 5, right? They just haven't thought of it. ENTJ just automatically picks up what 4 and 5 is. They use that introverted intuition, and they're just like, yeah, all you have to do is just add 4 and 5, and you got yourself a business. And 9 times out of 10, ENTJ, if they have the means to do it, they'll just steal the idea and run with it, right? Because they're very opportunistic in that way. So they could certainly see how a business could be effective and survive, they can be somewhat charming FI 4 slot, FE A slot. So it's not completely polar. There's something there. But they're certainly going to put the business ahead of the people, right? And I'm not trying to do any sort of celebrity typing or anything, but I kind of think of a Mark Zuckerberg type of person, right? I don't know if he's an ENTJ. I'm sure plenty of people have their thoughts on it, but that type of CEO that really sort of zoned in onto an opportunity and then was smart enough to surround himself with FE people once things got big enough. And I think ENTJs, if you get into their head, like it'll click and they'll see it. They'll say, "Oh yeah, like the last thing I want to do is deal with the inner office drama shit. So I'm going to get somebody to do that." Right? And they'll see the way that FE works within the system, right? Um, where maybe an ISTJ might be a little blind to it, more blind, and not see like, oh, this is something we obviously need. Like the ENTJ sees putting that FE person in their role as part of the system, where maybe an ISTJ and INTJ, it might not be as obvious to them. But you could probably talk them into it. If you get them away, get them out of their office for long enough. Okay. I guess whether or not the hierarchy is more TE or FE depends on if the company is more its people, its product or service or ideas. Okay. Yeah. And I certainly agree with that. A CEO, especially at a large public company or a very large company, is going to have some FE. Because again, they're dealing with running the organization, and the organization, especially in the tech industry, is about people. Like they like to say, their assets or their value goes up and down in the elevator every day. And interesting enough, you're seeing this where tech companies now out in Silicon Valley, they're not buying the company, they're just hiring all the engineers, right? Um, and so instead of having to go through antitrust and all that review, instead of buying the company outright, they just go in and hire everybody and say, okay, now everybody works for Microsoft. Like Microsoft tried to do that with OpenAI when they a couple of years ago. Obviously, things changed, so they didn't do it, but they tried. Point being, what was my point? Oh, right. So the type of company, I mean, a large public company where, again, the CEO's role is to make sure he's got the right people doing the right job in the right position and dealing with the politics of it all. There's a lot of other things that CEOs do. I'm not trying to distill it down to just FE stuff. They obviously have to know how to run the business. They obviously have to know how the business operates and all of that. But at the end of the day, they're making so many FE decisions. And to me, it's about when you go home, and CEOs a lot of times don't even go home, but at the end of the day, when you go home and you're exhausted, is it because you were making a bunch of FE decisions and you're our primary TE user, or you had to make a bunch of TE decisions and you're a primary FE user? And when you have decision fatigue. And I think a lot of CEOs and a lot of politicians, I've met a lot of like senators and Congress people and stuff, and they're all ESFJs. They're all ESFJs because they have to make decisions, FE decisions constantly. They have to make sure that people are happy when you're telling them no, right? That they do, and that's a very, very FE thing. Now, there's some obvious exceptions like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and all those that, probably Bill Gates, that are TE people. But again, they see a lot of times like, oh, I need somebody who is going to deal with all these FE decisions because I don't want to do it. Um, and it can actually go too far. There's this phenomenon you might remember 5 years ago or so. There's this phenomenon of like all these big new public companies, all these big companies that were going public. They saw themselves as like the saviors of the world. Like it was all this very, I mean, like we're gonna make money, but we're gonna use that money to make the world a better place, right? Like these Sam Bankman-Frieds that were just like grifting, like they felt like, hey, I could do whatever I want, and as long as I'm using my money, quote unquote, for good, then nobody can punish me or tell me that I'm doing something wrong, right? And so FTX was just like clearly violating like just fundamental rules of accounting and the law, doing all this shady stuff, and they didn't realize it, right? Like they like completely TE was completely nowhere to be found there. Like they had no TE, they had no process, they had no way of, unless they were just like the worst people in the world. I think they were kids and they had no idea what they were doing. And they were just like, oh, we'll just do it this way, we'll do it this way, and just like TI'd the whole thing. And they had no TE process, and it completely, bankrupted the industry. I mean, it killed crypto completely, and because everybody realized, oh shit, we can't trust these kids, can we? And that was an example of being, and the point being that Sam Bankman-Fried had this whole what? No, they had a name for it. It was like something capitalism, like social capitalism, or I don't know. There's some term for it, where the idea was we're going to be capitalistic and we're going to make money, but we're going to turn around and use that money for good, right? And we're going to donate $1 billion to this political party and this political cause and this charity and blah blah blah. Turns out it was all, obviously money laundering, when it comes down to it. But I think they were naive and didn't realize it. In a large part. They just kind of felt like, hey, we're using our money for good, so why would anybody care if we're not following basic accounting rules or anything? So you could certainly go too far, right? The opposite end of the spectrum. And WeWork was another example where they thought like they had this ENFJ type of cult leader CEO who was like, yeah, our business is renting out office space, for people who need temporary office space, but really we're going to change the world, right? Because everybody thought they were Steve Jobs, right? And everybody wanted to change the world in the way that Steve Jobs did or wanted to. And so to get investors around that time, you had to have this like weird social political impact that you're going to use your money for. Um, and WeWork, of course, fell apart because they didn't have enough TE figuring out how to do things the right way. And so, like all things in life, it's a balance, right? So yeah, sometimes it's good to have that visionary FE leader who's going to drum up the troops and get everybody going, and we're all going to make a lot of money and we're going to change the world. That's great, but you better have your number two CFO who is following Sarbanes-Oxley and following all the accounting rules and doing all the TE shit that you need to do, to balance that out and to make sure that you're not just running off the rails with all your FE gobbledygook, right? So it takes both types, and that's why you have a CEO and that's why you have a CFO. A lot of times, they both have to sign off on the publicly filed documents and all that, or financials. Um, so yeah, that's the way that the biz, public companies have sort of figured out this stabilizing that issue. Okay, anyway, going off the rails there. I guess for McDonald's values FE. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, McDonald's is. I like McDonald's, and I know they get a lot of shit. And I'm sure they're not healthy by any stretch of the imagination, but they are a very well run company. Um, and and I'm sure there are ways in which they put the corporate dollar above their employees, but all things being considered, and if you want to compare McDonald's to any other company, um, in fast food or service industry, um, I think they're pretty high up there. And my sisters all worked for McDonald's. Now that I think about it, they all liked it. I never did, but they did, and I think they generally treat their employees well. I'm sure it's not perfect, and I'm sure people can point to cases in which there are some pretty shitty people. I mean, it is a franchise business, so there's always going to be shitty owners. But I think, by and large, they see the FE part of it. Like paying for college, training, stuff like that. So I like McDonald's, but that's just my opinion. Great at multitasking people. Okay, yeah, I don't, yeah, yeah, and and from what I hear, again, I know next to nothing about them other than my own experience with them. But what I do hear is, first of all, they've got the process down, right? They've kind of been fucking it up now that you have to like order yourself. I don't like that at all. But in general, they certainly, there's a term in the business world, McDonaldization of things. Of, they got the TE stuff, the process, down, right? Of, customer turnover and making sure that they're happy at both, that they're in and out and happy, right? Um, so they got that TE stuff down, but they also have the FE stuff. Yeah, they're a pretty well balanced company, and you could tell. I mean, you really could tell. And I'm going off on a tangent here, but it goes to the principle of noticing TE in the world and noticing FE in the world. And I'm not sure if I've mentioned this before or not, but I grew up in the same town as the guy who started Jimmy John's, the franchise. And he was a friend of a friend, actually, somebody I worked with. I worked at a bar, and the bar owner knew him. And he would come in and he had all these stories about being efficient. Like he just knew how to make things efficient. And it was before Jimmy John's like really spread out. They only had a few stores in the area that I was in. But he really had the TE stuff down. And I'm not going to get into a bunch of detail. I just don't want to derail the whole point of the video. But I learned a lot about him, about TE process stuff, which is kind of funny being TE puller, but it's still a valued function. So I like learning about it. And ever since interacting with him, I could walk into any restaurant or any store and tell you whether they're going to be open in the next 6 months or a year. Um, and the number one thing is if you've got an owner who's doing too much. Like you walk into a restaurant and they have 50 items on the menu when really people only order 4 or 5 of them, right? And the owner's back there cooking everything, taking the orders, taking the the cash, running the register. Then he goes back and cooks, and then he comes out and clears the tables, and he's wiping down the tables, and he's mopping the floor. And he thinks he's saving money, right, by doing everything himself. But really, what he's doing is just killing himself and killing his business and not focusing on how to make the business better because he's constantly just quote unquote putting out fires, right? Um, and when you see that in any sort of business or any sort of store or restaurant where the owner is just doing everything, right? They're not going to last. It never lasts because they can't focus on the big picture things, right? They're focused on clearing off the tables and mopping the floor and running the register and cooking and blah 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 blah. That they don't take a step back and think like, okay, what's working and what's not working here. And so good organizations have that TE mindset where they can look and figure out what the process is. But they also have the worker bees doing all the stuff, all the SJs or all the SPs, doing all the worker stuff. Kids in college, kids in high school, whatever. And then you have the FE stuff, just sort of gluing it all together, right? I mean, that's how this is all supposed to work, but they sort of lose sight of that. Forget why I'm even going on this tangent, but I think the point is that you certainly, this is a cultural ecosystem, right? All these SJs, SPs, NTs, and NFs, you need them all to run an organization, to run a company. And you also need to know your lane, right? You have to know, like, okay, they're putting me in this TE spot. I'm TE polar. I better hunker down and figure this out, or find a way to, FE this stuff up real quick. Create a multitasking like an ostrich. I don't know. What somebody made the comment like an ostrich, but I missed when you said it, so I'm not sure what you're referring to. But sure. Okay. Probably gone on long enough for this session. I might come back. If anybody feels like chatting, and other things I was going to get on about, but now I lost my train of thought. Shane, if you're out there, give me a what's up. Like to hear your thoughts. Maybe we can collaborate on it, and I can just shit on 48 Laws of Power for a whole session. All right, we'll talk to you later. Have a good night. Bye.